In this lecture, I'd like to review some of the major impacts that the Norman Conquest had on the English language. But I'd also like to review some myths. I'd like to disabuse us of the notion that on some blustery day in the fall of 1066, the English language and English culture irrevocably changed, that one day Anglo-Saxons were a group of pipit-soaking, mad-swelling barbarians who overnight were transformed into a group of pups-eating champignon and a bureau blanc sauce. Nothing like that happened. The English language was changing long before. The Norman Conquest happened, and it continued to change throughout the British Isles in despite of whatever influence the French-speaking Normans might have had. So let's begin by looking at some, if you like, natural changes in Old English, things that we can chart and mark to see how Old English was already changing from its earliest times. Now, one of the things about studying language change in this way is that very often we have the problem of evidence. In an earlier lecture, I mentioned that the kind of evidence you want to have, the kind of written evidence you want to have, for studying language change as this fine-grained level if you want writing that reflects not the conventions of spelling, not learning forms, but the writing of people who are literate enough to know how to write, but whose writing they reflect pronunciation or certain changes as they're going on, not necessarily transcriptions of pronunciation, but the recognition that what they're writing down is something akin to or evocative of their speech in several documents. Written texts from the 10th and 11th centuries, we can see certain things already happening in Old English. First of all, we can see that the complex system of noun case endings is gradually being lost. Old English, as I have mentioned, had an inflectional system in which you use special endings on nouns to determine whether a noun was the subject of a sentence. The direct object, the indirect object, the object of position, or the instrument of an action. And these were highly specialized in distinctive endings, and they can be modified. If you study Old English today, you'll memorize them as grammatical parodism. But in many late Old English texts, the described writing seem almost indifferent to these endings. Is this a case of endings being lost in everyday speech? Is this a case of endings as it were falling into one another? The technical term for this is syncretism. That is where different endings are falling together into a smaller and smaller group of endings. When you have a limited collection of sounds that represent a gradually larger and larger set of grammatical categories. Adjective endings were being lost. In Old English, you had to have your adjective agree in number in case and in gender with the noun. It modified. Late Old English text shows us scribes increasingly sloppy, if you like, or indifferent to it, or perhaps reflecting the fact in everyday speech. Some of these things were changing verb endings were maintained, but they were simplified. Some fascinating features of Old English that were being lost, and I say fascinating, I mean fascinating to me, a philologist is the dual pronoun. They say something about the dual Indo-European and some early Indo-European language had a pronoun. In addition to the singular and the plural, I and we now in Old English you had another pronoun. A third pronoun, the dual, which is the two of us. Unk or anchor Old Norse has it, many of the old Germanic languages have it, some other Indo-European languages have it. This is something that could be used especially in discourse to refer to a conversation with the two people. The two of us are going, you would not say. We used say ank, and so what happened was that this distinctive feature, which was not in the Romance languages, this was being lost, nobody's quite sure why, but it gradually disappears. Nouns were no longer masculine, feminine, or neuter. How do we know this? We know this because when you read sentences in late Old English, you will occasionally find certain nouns like, for example, a noun like with which I mentioned in a previous lecture, now even though the noun with refers to a female being. It is grammatically a neuter noun, and in a sentence, if you wanted to use a pronoun to refer back to the wife you were talking about, you would use the pronoun he, which is the Old English neuter pronoun. What we say it, so you would not say the wife blah blah blah. She was doing this. You would say the wife it was doing this overtime. The wife gradually gets to be referred to as she rather than an it. This is an issue not of culture. That is an issue of grammar and gradually natural gender replaces. Let's look at the stress. Old English, like all of the Germanic languages, had fixed stress on the root syllable of the word. That is that regardless of what prefixes or suffixes you added to your word, the stress remained on the root syllable. Come, become, timber, buy timber, be timber is the Old English verb meaning to build. And so, swear yan to answer yan, answer. So what you have in Old English as in the Germanic languages is an insistent stress on the root syllable. Now this is not true of the Romance languages, when you have the variable stress on the words, but it is true of the Germanic, and the belief among some scholars has been that this insistent stress tended to level out the sounds of unstressed syllables. That means that any sound or any syllable that did not take a full word stress, such as a grammatical ending, would not have been pronounced clearly. So for example, if you are saying man no ma for an inflected pronoun of the noun of man, it might be mom and mum, and it might be swallowed, garbled, or it might gradually in everyday speech. So despite in the distance of the sound that can no longer able to distinguish it, this is one theory. Another is form and function. As our final endings become harder to distinguish, new ways of establishing meaning were necessary. What does this mean? Old English had a fully developed set of prepositions of with, before, and to. They were used to signal relationships among words in sentences in various kinds of phrases, but you still had case endings that could do that and so. For example, a noun in the dative case did not need a preposition. What does this mean? Old English had a fully developed set of prepositions of with, before, and to. They were used to signal relationship among words in sentences in a various kinds of phrases. But we still had a case endings that could do that and so. For example, a noun in the dative case did not need a preposition. Let me give you an example from poetry. Hymn by Valdez, word horn in laughs, that a line from Valdez hymn and hymn. The eldest unlocked. His word hoard. What's lovely about the sentences too is the way in which it gives us another Old English caning. The word hoard is the mind. To unlock your word hoard is to speak. There is no preposition in that line, but him is in the dative case, and so what you must translate as to him, the oldest unlocked. His word, the oldest one, spoke to him. You can do that in Old English, you really can't do that in Modern English because you need a preposition. What's happening in Middle English? What's happening in Late Old English and Middle English? Is these grammatical categories are losing their distinction and preposition are as it were taking over. And so what you have here in a relationship of form and function, a corollary of that is the pattern of words order become regularized. In other words, in Old English of the classic period, as in say Latin, your relationship among nouns was determined by the cases and the case endings in word order. While not irrelevant, was not the primary determiner of that meaning. What happens in late Old and early Middle English is that word order becomes the way of expressing grammatical relationships in a sentence, and standard forms of word order like subject, verb, object. I gave the ball to the boy. These become the standard patterns, and so syntax, if you like, takes over as a way of determining meaning, and English moves from highly inflected to a relatively uninflected language. What is the evidence for this kind of change? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, what you want in written evidence is a level of literacy good enough to record sounds and forms. So highly developed that you're getting conventions of writing apart from speech, but what you also want. And this is what I'm going to add to that is you want datable and localizable writing. You want to know where a text was written, and you want to know when it was written. Ideally, you want to know something about who wrote in this kind of information will help you localize and determine linguistic change through written evidence. Now, during the Anglo-Saxon period, scholars, monks, teachers, scribes, they keep annals, year-by-year histories in prose and the so-called Anglo-Saxon chronicle. Exists in several versions is one of the great examples, in fact, one of the great European examples across the board of history writing in the vernacular, and this Anglo-Saxon chronicle was maintained at several different locations. That is, there were several different monasteries where the monks were doing this in Peterborough in East Anglia. Now about an hour's drive from modern-day Cambridge and Peterborough, the monks keep a prose history of England until the year 1154. That is almost a century after the Norman conquest. You had people writing Old English prose. It changes, it's impacted in two ways. It's impacted in the wrong way to use impacted. It's impacted by Norman conquest. It's impacted with language, with words. It is a dense, clustered document that records language change in ways that are at times subtle and significant. I want to turn to the Peterborough Chronicle because I want to use it as a piece of evidence for the details of language change, because Peterborough was somewhat geographically removed from the initial impact of the Norman conquest. Its records illustrated few effects of Norman's French now. It's organized where each entry is the set of events, but a year begins, 852, in this year 1037. In this year, the following happened. Now the thing I want to stress is that the chronicle was not necessarily kept year by year, but it was, as it were, rewritten year by year. In other words, the evidence that we have is that in given spaces of time every 20 years, sometimes every 10, maybe every 5, sometimes every 1, a scribe would sit down and he would copy what happened in a given set of years. So the entries for 1120 may have written in 1120, or they may have been written in 1122. The entries in 1130 may have been written in 1154. So we're not talking about somebody year by year writing, but what we are talking about is a work of history that is arranged year by year, where the changes in language, marked as it were in blocks in gross, form the ways in which the English language was changing during the transitional period right after the Norman conquest. Let me give you an example. The entry for 1083 begins on visum era and e signal, a dative masculine singular. So this is a perfect classic Old English. In this year 1117, the entry begins on this era. Here you don't have the UN ending for this. In this year you have an ON ending. What does that mean? Does it mean that the ending is actually changed, or does it mean that the scribe is saying on this 1 year where you have an indiscriminate vowel and an indiscriminate and more an NA phone attritional had a nasal? Now, maybe this is the scribe attempt to preserve a grammatical ending. Maybe it's the scribe attempt to preserve the sound of speech. Whatever it is, it's not correct. In 1135, the entry begins on this era. You have a total loss of adjective ending. It's just this. It's not this. Only it's not this on, but you do have the end of era year, and it still signals a dative concord and grammatical gender is gone by this time. What does that mean? Meaning they just don't care about the grammatical gender of noun 1154, the last entry on this year. Endings have completely dropped away. We are no longer in the world of inflected Old English. This is a fascinating example. It is a simple example, but to me it is a remarkably illustrative example of how we can trace grammatical change in text. What are some other changes and how we can trace them? There are word order patterns that are being regularized. We can see in a text like the Peterborough Chronicle the order of subject, verb, object becoming the standard for the simple declarative sentence. Now, other words order patterns came to be used for special kinds of expression. For example, if you wanted to ask a question or stress a point, you would invert the order verb, subject, object. So I know the question. Know I the way we? we would say, do I know the way? You know the way statement, know you, the way question. This is modern English is an arc ISM in Shakespeare and the King James Bible. The end of the 6th, the beginning of the 7th centuries, you can still see as a future of word order. Other archaic SIMS are there, for example, one of the characteristic features of late Old English and early Middle English. As in the Germanic languages is the use of this indirect a kind of relationship where you're talking about a state of mind. What do I mean by this in Old English and in Middle English? You would not say, I think. You would say, methinks. Now, that's not methinks. That's not stupid. That's not ungrammatical. Is that the word think here? Does not mean the operation of active thought. It means seeming. Methinks really is, it seems to me. It is an stated subject where the object here is the first person. So, when you see things like meetings, translate it as it seems to me. This show up again as later Shakespeare and the King James Bible, and it's the kind of grammatical inheritance from this period of transition in the English language. The sound of the language was changing. French and Norman impact was changing forms of pronunciation, but in certain areas of the British Isles, relatively untouched by the Norman conquest. Let me give you some examples. English had a set of characteristic consonant clusters that gave it its distinctive sound. These include the HL cluster, Kuyana, which is the word laps, the HR cluster, Kranya, which is the word ring, and the H and the cluster, Nephron, which is the word knee. What a horse does this were leveled out 2L, 2LR plus 2, and these consonants cluster were being reduced. FN cluster with the clusters used to a signal if you like nasal explosion, Nastya, and a snort yawn, and snort where the FM is gradually changed to an SM. Another distinctive cluster is the aspirate and glide. Wow, what? Written, wow. It, what, that's the opening word of Beowulf. What, listen, it's an explanation. This becomes simply a W, what, that initial aspiration is lost, other sounds are changing. There is a comprehension of syllables. Cloth, layer, the guardian or warden of the loft. Cloth, loft, cloth. Old English loft, word we saw the word in Cadman's hymn, the warden or the guardian of the loft. Who is the guardian of the loft? The cloth word, the Lord. This is the etymology of the word Lord. Lord is the guardian of the loft. The meter out of red in a serial society, so you can see how this comprehension is happening over time. Metathesis is the inversion of sounds in order. Now, some people who speak regional dialects or what we think of as regional dialects in America will metatize. May say, ask for us. When my son was 5, he said Miss Gitty instead of spaghetti. Now, metathesis is something that can happen in everyday speech, but metathesis is something that can also happen at particular moment in time. In other words, certain words in Old English were permanently metatized, that is, they changed their sound and pronunciation permanently. By switching around certain sounds, Old English breed become early Middle English breed, Old English action become early mid, lately as per become true, a or become bright. Metathesis is an important sound change. At this time, I'd mentioned strong verbs and some of them, like need and help and wax, were changing to weak verbs. The system of making meaning was changing at the same time. What we have here is a way of looking at Old English changing on its own, but also changing in response to certain aspect of the French language as the Normans came in now to this point. I've talked about prose and I've talked about certain words in isolation. What I would like to do at the close of this lecture is talk about poetry. Old English poetry, you recall from my lecture on Cadman's hymn, was alliterative instructor, that is, Old English poetic line was determined by how many strong stresses there were in it, and making those stresses alliterate. It did not matter how many syllables there were in total in the line, and nor was rhyme the consecutive principle of organization. These are some Old English poems in rhyme is used, but that's just an ornament or a trick or a tour de force on a continent. In France, poetry was working differently. The organization of the poetic line was determined by the absolute number of the line. So if you had 8 syllables, it was an octave syllabic line. And if it was 8 syllables and they were iambic, you would have iambic tetrameter 4 beats or stresses or feet. Iambic pentameter, so the decasyllabic line would be pentameter. The octosyllabic line trainer, that's what we think of when we think of poetry. That is, we think of poetry as regularly metered language with the number of syllables in the line matters, and where it rhymes, yes, they're free verse in a modern world. But in the classic period, and certainly when we think of Give Me a Poem, we think of a set of numbers of syllables in a line and rhyme. This is an important into England. Among the things the French brought were not simply, as we will see in subsequent lecture, not simply words for court and culture, and cuisine, not simply francophone forms of identity, but they brought a new way of doing poetry. And as a bridge to my next lecture, I want to end with the opening of one of the most beautiful poems in early Middle English. It's called The Owl and the Nightingale, and it's a debate poem, in which the narrator imagines that he was wandered into a beautiful forest, and he hears an owl and nightingale speaking and debating their various virtues and vices. It's a fantasy poem, and there were many of them like this in the Middle Ages. What's distinctive about The Owl and the Nightingale is the way it begins. This is a poem that was composed probably about the year 1200. It was survives in two handwritten manuscripts from the middle 13th century.